for the accessibility law and DPWH's Departmental Order 37. And notice the years, PP 344 was 1982, and then DO 37 was 2009 series. So, well, if we have them, why do we have what we have now? Bakit nga, why is it safer to walk on the road rather than on the sidewalk? And from experience, what I believe we need to do is we need to inform ourselves as advocates, as practitioners, and if we have to, push our road builders, our designers, to have a better understanding of the regulatory and usability concepts. Why do you have to have a certain slope? What does it mean to be independently mobile? That is what I can tell from personal experience. And my personal experience, just roughly, I'm a civil engineer by training, traffic engineering, got into transit projects, pedestrian planning. And at this point, you realize how these things work, and accessibility and traffic safety becomes a part of your advocacy. So we should remind others that accessibility interventions make lives easier for us all. It's not just an accommodation for a few. So how many of us enjoy automatic doors? Lalo na kung marami kang dala, bit-bit mo, kaliwat kanan, paano mo bubuksan yung pinto? Yeah. And it doesn't stop there. If we look about all the other accessibility interventions that have happened in the past, like for the typewriter to what we have now as electronic keyboard, we use our computers, our screens, and the eye gaze screen tracking technology. It's now used for a lot of vehicles, for autonomous vehicle driving. And the gyroscope for a two-wheel wheelchair gave rise to the Segway. And a lot of now, if we think about the neuro headsets that people use and what we could do with it, so a lot of it really is application that benefits us all. Now, when we talk about public right-of-way, in terms of accommodation, there are two things that come into mind. There's two elements. First is the curb ramp. And the curb ramp is for the mobility and visually impaired, and the accessible pedestrian signals. And that is for those with visual and hearing impairment. So we need to think about what are the needs and how do we address, imagine yourself as being blind and having to cross the street, or being unable, on a wheelchair and therefore having to negotiate, a 1-inch or a 2-inch rise in the sidewalk. So first of all, let's talk about ramp standards. So just the basics. It's worth pointing out that the key requirement here is the slope. It's not the length of the ramp. What it's supposed to do is it's supposed to allow one to independently negotiate a change in grade. Maswerte tayo sa Pilipinas dahil may magtutulak sa atin. Pero, it's also that independence that we want to make sure that everyone has the ability. So the third bullet point here, that's when we talk about the grade o yung slope, gaano katirik yung ramp. 1 in 12 allows you to roll yourself up, and 1 in 20, yung cross slope is for stability. So when you're making a turn, you're not dragged to the left or dragged to the right. Width equal to crosswalk is one of those items so that it's accessible for the whole width of the crosswalk, although, it changes sometimes. So let's look at the standards, just basics. I think we have different levels of understanding on what we have. So in terms of local standards, just talking about the basic parts of the ramp, so we could inform ourselves. So, it's a curb ramp, and the curb ramp has two components. It has the top landing and it has the bottom landing. Sorry, can we go to the next slide, please? I think I'm a bit ahead of you. Okay. Okay, thanks, Riz. Yeah, so the curb ramp, you have the top landing and the bottom landing. And then the curb, what we call the curb, is actually kumbaga yung gutter, between the carriageway and the sidewalk. So when we will say drop curb, yung curb na yon is dropped to the level of the sidewalk, of the carriageway. Okay. Now, one thing that I've noticed as well, looking at the two standards that we have here, there seems to be a bit of confusion or inconsistency in the reference of length and width of the two documents. But basically, those are the key parts. And so another observation on the current standards, next slide, please. There's this exclusion that if, now we're talking about curb cut, if the sidewalk is less than 3.5 meters, which is, undoubtedly most of our sidewalks are less than 3.5 meters. And it says we don't have to have a curb cut anymore for the mobility impaired. Again, there are ways around that. And then the second one, what we don't have on the standards yet, as of yet anyway, I know some projects are starting to incorporate them, newer designs, are yung what we call tactile or detectable warning surfaces. And basically what it does is it tells you where the edge of the sidewalk is before you step onto the live carriageway. So, you could feel the difference in texture. So if we have all of this, right, because of this, and, and partly because of this and partly for other reasons, yung current status natin is that we have mixed results. Next slide, please. So it goes, from having nothing, having no drop curves, to having some well-intentioned applications, but not really accessible because they don't meet the standards. And then, when we talk about not just the crosswalks, but the sidewalk themselves, we have non-existent sidewalks because the pedestrian access route has been given to some other function. So, to inform what we do and to set a bar basically to where we might, where we could be to improve this, I'm going to draw on some experiences that I've had, on the work that was done, elsewhere. And one good, I'm sure, a lot of our friends here are aware of the other standards that we have elsewhere. So next slide, please. So when we talk about curb ramp standards, one good resource is the PROWAG or Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines published by the U.S. Access Board. Similar to BP 344, but it also provides specific design solutions as well as the ideal sidewalk conditions or designs, okay? So, that's one resource. We could share a link to that later on. But basically also when we talk about curb ramp, it's as I said, it's a complex environment. And so there's many types of curb ramps. So I just want to go through some of the design solutions that we could have. So the first one is, the more common ones, right, are the perpendicular ramp, wherein the flow direction, the ramp is basically perpendicular to the curb. Or you have the parallel ramp, wherein the ramps are parallel to the carriageway or to the curb. So the whole landing is depressed and it's the same level, more or less the same level as the carriageway. We also have what we call as depressed corners, where your landing, the ramps are basically as you approach from either side of the corner, and then the whole landing is depressed. And then I'd like to point out here also yung placement, the placement of the detectable warning surfaces, as you could see, where it gives the one who's visually impaired that tactile feedback that he's just about to walk into, a live traffic lane. There are other types, more complex types, and these are generally in response to certain conditions. And the first one-way directional, wherein basically you're just approaching the corner from one direction and there's only a one crossing. Combined directional is both arms of the intersection have crosswalks. And then one solution that has come out where we have very large turning radii. So kumbaga yung korte ng kanto, malaki because it's trying to fit a truck, large vehicles. So they make the turning radius o yung kurba maluwang. So in that case, you have what we call a fan. And then yung tactile paving is in the form of an arc. So, it gets quite complex. So that's why I'm saying, our standards need to develop a bit more. And I'm just sharing a sample here from an extract from the work that, our reference material for work that I had in the US. For example, this is the standard plans for the Minnesota Department of Transportation. And it contains 6 sheets with about 60 detailed drawings. Compared to the current standards that we have now, there's definitely room for improvement, but there's also a lot of material that we could draw on already that was done elsewhere. And then it's that case of introducing this and getting them, adjusted to suit our conditions. But there's a lot of guidance out there that we could refer to inform what we try to do here. Yeah. And in addition to having the standards, one thing that we also should remember is that, improvements do not happen immediately. Even in more resourced countries, like, trabaho namin sa US, was that if you look at the implementation timeline they had, the ADA came into law, or the American with Disabilities Act came into law in 1990. And then a lot of the agencies really did not do much until 2010 when they were forced to do transition plans. And this is because, because of lawsuits, that were coming around because of discrimination, because of accidents. And I'm not really sure, and this is an interesting point of conversation for us, what would be the trigger for us to look more seriously at our public right-of-way accommodation? Yeah. And having said that, even though the transition plan came about, 10 years ago, standard plates are still developing. So yung mga design solutions are still developing because it's a complex environment. Yeah. But one thing that I think would be good for us as a target for now is to look at what would be the transition plan. And, that starts with identifying existing facilities, doing audit of old construction as well as new construction, describing the methods on how we're going to make those more accessible, and then develop a schedule. Kailan natin babaguhin, when do we make them compliant? And then lastly, to identify an official responsible for seeing that the plan is implemented. So, an ADA coordinator, a mobility coordinator, let's call it. In fact, for the US, when we talk about advocacy for walking and cycling, it was also something that really helped a lot of the public works offices when they started hiring internally pedestrian and walking planners inside the engineering departments. And, I know we do that now here, probably not uniformly because of different abilities, but it's definitely something that would help change the mindset, on how we design and build things. So reflecting briefly on what was done and lessons learned from, what we've experienced elsewhere. Okay, so first of all, as I said, it's not a one size fits all. Even with great standard plans, it's not always easy. Lalo na scope. Kasi, when I say scope of the project, pagka sinabi, we're only going to install sidewalks, pedestrian ramps, curb ramps. Pero minsan, there are existing structures there, like in the case of this picture, where you have the fire hydrant and you have the drainage, making the placement really difficult. And so then you cannot meet your standards. So then it's a question of, how do you scope the work that needs to be done so that you could actually deliver a solution. Okay. Other lessons learned, and road layouts. Okay, large corner radius. In this case, if we're so focused on big vehicles, right, means that the road layouts need to consider all pedestrians at the very beginning of the design process, because smaller turning radius or smaller corners are better for pedestrian accommodations, because it's shorter in terms of crossing distance, right? And also it allows you to have a better accommodation for your curb ramps. Like, in this case, what does not work here is that even though you have tactile paving, if you're approaching this and you are visually impaired, you would actually miss the tactile paving because there's a large gap between the carriageway and the sidewalk. So, it becomes an issue. So one thing that we learned also was that giving people, giving the designers and the contractors just the standard plan, it doesn't really work. So, everyone needs a better understanding on how it should be done. And so, to a certain level, like what we do with our, highway engineers, there needs to be new training and new certification for people who are going to design this and do this properly. And sometimes it does get a bit difficult where, the key is understanding what you're trying to do and not just relying on plans. Because as I said, there are existing conditions, like in this case, a lot of our sidewalks already have adjoining buildings. So we need to be able to adapt our design to suit your local conditions and match what we could do, to provide an accessible route as much as possible. Okay, and so the next one, I'm not sure, Riz, if we want to take questions or should I just continue?
You can proceed, sir. We have a section for questions later on.
Okay, so next I'll just jump into the accessible pedestrian signals, or we like acronyms sa Pilipinas, diba? So APS, accessible pedestrian signals. Okay, now it gets a bit more complex, and to a certain extent, siguro it's something that we might not see immediately dito sa Pilipinas, right? But again, it's an accommodation, like I said, that's very important for those who are, visually impaired, and for those who are hearing impaired. Okay, so there are different standards in this, and again, just pointing out a potential reference. The US has the Manual for Urban Traffic Control Devices. I'm sure our friends from DOTR are familiar with this. And again, it's a good reference point for reference material for looking at what we could do. And basically, the general dimensions are there in terms of button height, spacing between the different signal poles. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but just to point out what are the challenges when we have accessible pedestrian signals. So the next slide talks about the intent, right? There's a lot of technical items, pero in its core, this is what you're trying to do, yeah? So the left photo shows the real challenges. The first one, if you have a button, is it actually accessible? Is there a place, a landing, 1.2 by 1.2 meter next to the signal button where you could have a sidewalk, where you could have a flat landing so that the person in a wheelchair could actually be stable, right? Park the wheelchair and reach to the button. And then, of course, is the button reachable? Is it oriented properly to where you want to cross, right? So, it's that concept of how is it going to be used? And imagining ourselves doing this really leads to a lot of the solutions, they come forward. Now, in terms of lessons learned, it's basically the same thing. We talk about education for the designers. Standards cannot always work, but you need to know the function, right? And I also, have to say one thing that really helps with the mindset of transportation department in Minnesota, where I was working before, was they hired engineer Todd Gruel, who was the ADA, American with Disability and Acts, project office manager. He was the lead implementer within the department. And that really changed the mindset of people working with him. And like I said earlier, it's also appointing pedestrian and cycling advocates in planner positions within the departments. That really helps change the culture and the process and how we design our public right-of-way. Unfortunately, it's a level of awareness that a lot of us do not have. Yeah. So, with that in mind, being, an advocate and talking to advocates, I also want to share a couple of experiences that I had working with different advocacy organizations. Some of them we might be able to adopt here, just to highlight some strategies and also, some potential, movements or ideas that we could have to promote public right-of-way accessibility. So the first one was working with the St. Paul Smart Trips, which is a federally funded, so it's government funded to promote alternatives to single occupant vehicle trips. So basically, it's a commuter program that helps get people out of their cars. And what we used to have is we would have an annual commuter fair where we would promote transit, carpooling, bicycling among different employers, among the large employers. One interesting program would be, hosting open streets. We talked about it earlier. We have open streets in Ortigas now. We have open streets in BGC. It's bringing those, I think, to where the residents are, to the actual high streets where people live, where we have the most conflict. It's easy to do them in CBDs where there's very little traffic on the weekend. But, if we want to change people's minds about things like this, I think we need to, and I know we could set the bar higher in terms of, reaching out and having a more, neighborly, more active event where people live, and to introduce this to their local communities. Another program which was interesting was Women on Bikes. And this is because, as we know, women are underrepresented, right, in the active mobility community. And so this was one item where one program where we encourage women to form the groups. We had cycling education for women, safe riding tips. And I'll just go on to the next one. I know I'm running a bit late, but just the last few slides here. One other activity is transit for livable communities. And basically this was a pilot program that was done where, like what we're doing now, with the UNDP program with DOTR on expanding the bike network, right? This was done, and the key here was they had pilot programs in 4 communities, but one key item was it was also used to evaluate how investments and planning for infrastructure and public education can increase rates of bicycling and walking. Basically, there was a lot of attention on collecting data so that the next programs could be, you have a lot of data to support what you want to do. And then this led to convincing a lot of politicians to put investment in active mobility. So the next one is a community-based movement. It's called Stop For Me, and it's a crosswalk safety campaign. This one was purely community organized, and this was working with the schools, the Safe Routes to School people, with the police, where we would do crosswalk education. What are the pedestrian rules? So we would work with the councils or the barangays as we have them here. We would identify hotspots for accidents, pedestrian safety, and we will coordinate with community volunteers to organize an education campaign. And the police will be there to either ticket or give warning, just to remind everyone, and also to protect our volunteers, because you never know what might happen. But basically, it's like it's to draw people's attention to what are the rights of us as pedestrians. And it didn't, in addition to that, the campaign also advocated for speed reduction within the street, within the residential streets. And also we advocated for better language in the driver's manual. It's probably one of those things that we also, could think a bit more as we do discuss driver education in the Philippines. How do we educate them with regards to interacting with pedestrians and bicyclists, and how that could be formalized as part of the education. And one final item that I would like to share is, having a transportation committee within the city. Basically, what this allowed us to do was, it was an offshoot. It was a subcommittee of the Planning Commission that issued permits. It was, it looked at government, at the city projects, and how these projects are designed so that they respond. We have different representatives from the logistics, from the businesses, from the transit users, from the pedestrians, from the bicyclists, from the mobility impaired, expanding the bike network, and also from the different barangays or the different district councils. So, this one was a committee that gave recommendations to the mayor on how city budgets are going to be spent and how city projects are going to be designed. Again, it's community working with the local agencies for a better solution. What that was also, what made that possible also was, because of this, then you get a lot of representation when you're developing pedestrian plans or bicycle plans or traffic safety plans. So I want to close with key messages. Sorry if I'm running a bit late. When we talk about, making our public right-of-way accessible, we have to remember and we have to tell everyone that it's to benefit everybody. The standards need to be better defined compared to what we have now, but there's a lot of reference material. And I know we are doing that, for the bike guidelines that that DPWH issued, there was a lot of reference to NACTO guidelines in the US, which are the city transportation agencies. But the standards need to be understood by designers and builders. So there needs to be an education to that part. The same thing with our LGUs. There needs to be better push, to get buy-in, to hire the right people and to train them properly. And, hats off to everyone, hats off to Move as One Coalition, and also to Advocates for Inclusion, because, advocacy is really needed to push for change. And lastly, change can be slow. And so, in terms of aiming what we want, possibly a good place to start is looking at a transition plan, as it will be very important. Well, with that, Riz, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity again. And, I look forward to hearing more from, about what you do and, how we could work together to advocate for what we believe, is an equitable transportation, for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sir John. That was such a great talk. I learned so much. I think my personal favorite part was the campaign you shared about Stop For Me, the community campaign, because I recall when I was teaching here in a public school in Quezon City before the pandemic hit, I had a student who wasn't able to make it to class one day because she got hit by a tricycle right outside our school, because our school is located in a very busy street. So I think those types of things are really important, especially your point on educating drivers on how to better interact with pedestrians, how to put pedestrians as the priority on our streets. So there, I really love
Thank
our
you.
talk today, sir. We can proceed to our open forum. We have taken in some questions. So for people who are still watching us on Facebook or here in our Zoom call, you can chat your questions here or put it in the link that we sent below. Or you could also raise your hand to verbally ask your question to Sir John. But we can begin with those that are already here. I'm not sure if Mon would share the screen for the Dory, but I will read the first question, Sir John. So, our first question is from an anonymous person. The question reads, how much money, time, and effort would it take to rebuild existing structures and incorporate accessibility features? So, first question, parang hirap naman.
Gaano kahaba ang PC? Yeah, I cannot speak to that. I'm not that familiar with, the scope. It all depends, because the scope it could be so varied, right? But when we talk about investment and cost effectiveness, surely we could we could easily justify any investment and in sidewalk. And it's also a question of equity. It's not really a question of money, right? It's a question of doing the right thing so that we are all independently mobile. So I wouldn't put a dollar sign on what we need to actually make it happen. It's just a question of equity and safety, of course. I remember when I got back here, people were talking about how dangerous our streets are. So I bike to work, or I have an electric scooter to work, kick scooter to work. And they say the traffic must be bad because, so you must be riding on the sidewalk. Pero sabi ko nga, mas delikado nga sa sidewalk eh. Mas safe pa dun sa street eh. So, it really is to that point wherein our sidewalks are not usable. We're not just talking about making it, improving them for accessibility, but we have an opportunity, we could hit everything in one go.
I agree,
Sorry.
sir. Yeah. Thank you so much for your answer, sir. I agree that it's very difficult to peg a price on it, but the investment is surely worth it. And I actually kind of laughed a little at what you shared about using this street to get to work because the sidewalks are more dangerous. It echoes our experience sometimes in commuting where the jeeps would actually take over the sidewalk. So because they needed to move a little faster on the road. The next question, sir, is a little bit related to the one that you answered, but I think not without the price factor. The next question reads, how can we make existing roads accessible, inclusive, or bike friendly, especially those that are narrow, like esquinitas, and barely have any sidewalks? Is it possible, or can we do it to make the roads that already are there, to make them accessible and inclusive? What do you think, sir?
Yeah, actually, it's that with regards to the esquinitas, yeah, there's a lot of reference to practice, in Europe, where they call them home streets, right? Or wharfs in Netherlands, basically, yeah. And where there is no sidewalk and it's just a free surface where you have pedestrians and you have vehicles intermingled, right? That's basically what we have in our esquinitas, right? Because it's slow moving. It's not really an issue of safety. It's more of an issue of comfort. And so we just need to, institutionalize on how we make those esquinitas, a bit more pleasant in a way. Yeah, because in terms of function, safety is not concerned because they're usually low traffic. A lot of them, you have, sidecars or tricycles that run through. So, it's adapting that mindset, that application to what we have now. We talked about, what would make you walk instead of, for short distances, right? We talked about trees. We talk about a more pleasant environment. So, we could think about how we could beautify those esquinitas to make them more pleasant, better lighting, especially at night. Again, there's a lot of movements elsewhere about pedestrian safety for women, for anyone who is concerned, really, basically for personal safety. So, we don't, we don't want to have like pedestrian or bike superhighways, because that's the nature of the street. It has a complex function, and we have a lot of road users that need to balance it. But the key there is making the amenity level improvement to make it a more pleasant walk. And then you don't worry about, walking the 500 meters or 100 meter because you had a pleasant experience.
Thank you, sir, for that. I agree that we really should share our roads. And I like what you shared about the home streets or slow moving streets from Europe. I think that's a very good concept that perhaps we could also try here to just close down the esquinitas and have people walk in it. A little related to that, sir, is the next question from an anonymous person again. It's about tactile pavement. So how do you suggest, sir, that tactile pavers could be used in the sidewalk? Is it advisable to provide tactile guide paths in the entire length of the sidewalk in consideration for the blind and people of low vision?
Yeah, normally they are used to define a place where you have, basically a place of safety. And then it's meant to delineate where the condition changes, so it's a bit more unsafe. So like in, a lot of train stations, it's also used to guide people from the ticket barriers to the platform, right? And then you have them along the platform edge, where the train or the bus platform is. So you don't want to fall into the tracks, yeah? Doon sa release ng tren, kaya naglalagay sila doon sa gilid. It's the same application for our public right-of-way, wherein you're telling the pedestrian na ito na yung huling hakbang mo. Pag humakbang ka beyond this, baka meron ng sasakyan na dadaan and you need to be careful. So it's different applications in different countries. Some of them apply them, they make them directional. So kumbaga yung direction mo is perpendicular kung saan ka pupunta. And it's not always possible to do that. So it's basically, the basic concept is to give you a warning na you're coming from a place of safety to a place that is less safe.
Noted, sir. Thank you. So, yun pala yung purpose ng mga tactile sa train stations. I didn't really know until you
Audio
mentioned.
button to activate. Press spacebar.
Ayan. So thank you, sir, for that. Yeah. In relation to that, again, is the next question, a little related to that, is about which members of a contracted group are usually equipped with the knowledge on accessibility features? Or I guess a better phrasing of this is who should know how to do accessibility features? Because the person who asked this also included, is it the engineers or the architects or the planners? Is there a monopoly of the knowledge on
Yeah.
accessibility features?
No, there's no monopoly of the knowledge. Even the advocates, people like, a lot of you here, should be part of the planning process. But when we talk about the public right of way, obviously it becomes the road designers, the road engineers, who are ultimately responsible for implementing and incorporating them in their designs. And it goes back to what I said earlier about, we had to introduce a level of certification for contractors and their designers so that we know that if they build something, it's not going to be torn down again, hindi lang sisirain. Like yung pinakita kong picture doon kanina on the work that we're doing for audits, some of those were just constructed like the week before, and this was the problem that, they were having. They had the standard plates, pinapagawa nila, pero yung mga contractors, they had difficulty implementing them. And so it really, at the end of the day, it's the remit of the designers to understand them, but having people around them who are well informed, who could advocate for better solutions really does help.
Thank you, sir. And I agree that it's best if a lot more of us know how to advocate for accessibility features, especially. And I like what you said, that it should be a standard for the contractors that we take, that they know how to do it. I can't speak for our contractors because I'm not one, but I hope it is something that we would get to do sometime. Okay, sir. Another question is about standards that we adhere to. So this person asked, would it be better if we use European standards like Dutch standards for bike lanes instead of US standards? I don't actually know what standards the Philippines uses, but what do you think, sir? Is there significant difference of using these standards in constructing our bike lanes, for example?
Both standards are really results of best practice. Yeah, best practice, in each location. So it's going to be a learning curve for us. But since our highway standards are more closely aligned to the US practice, and even then, I don't really agree with some of the US practice also. I would prefer some of the European practices because they are more focused on narrow streets. But the US has wide streets, and then they're converting. All the avenues are wide, and so because of familiarity, for us, it's probably I'd say like what we did for the bikes, the bike standards. It's an easier transition. Although the European standards are metric, so for those engineers, it's a lot easier to think about meters compared to inches and feet. It gets a bit less confusing. Yeah. But the message there is that both are results of good practice. So they are both good. What we need to figure out is, once we implement them, how do we tailor them to what we actually have as a context? But you can't go wrong compared to what we have.
That is very true, sir. Contextualization is very key to the things that we want to happen, and I hope the metric system gains more power. In a little similar question again is about model inclusive cities or LGUs in the Philippines. Do you have any where LGUs could get inspiration? Have you seen any cities or LGUs here that you think other LGUs could use as a reference or a benchmark or inspiration for their streets accessibility?
Existing ones in the Philippines. I better not say anything. Favoritism. Yeah, well, it's up to you to figure out who are the most, progressive ones. But, it's, ang question din dyan kasi it becomes a capability. I know that some LGUs are better staffed than others because of, because of the size of the city. Some are more resourced compared to others because of their tax base. Yeah. But there's no shortage of, we have a lot of good examples that we aspire to. Residential streets probably is a bit more difficult, but, we had pilot projects in Marikina, we have pilot projects in Pasig, we have pilot projects in Quezon City, in Manila, we had, placemaking projects, right? Makati and Taguig have, the CBD projects, a different context, but definitely something that we enjoy. And this is the thing that I want to raise also is that, if you think about, for all of us who travel and figure out, when you go as a tourist, what was your favorite memory of that? And where was that? And, 99% you're going to say it was when I was walking along this street, along this boulevard, right? And that's what sticks when we travel elsewhere. What was your favorite thing in a place? And so that should lead us to thinking about, when people come to the Philippines, what is it that they would say was their favorite experience? And how do our streets measure against that?
Thank you, sir. I actually look forward to the time where we can see a lot of tourists and have them say something like that about their experience in the Philippines. Our next question, I think someone wants to speak up. If Oliver is ready with this question, he has questions.
Thank you. So, iba naman magsalita.
Yeah. Inom po muna akong tubig.
Hello po, good afternoon.
Hi.
So as an ordinary resident lang po, someone not in a seat of power, for example, how can we lobby for our LGUs to make our streets more accessible and more friendly to pedestrians?
It starts with organizing. There's community organizing. We could have a barangay. We have a champion in each barangay that would advocate for this. We see this in our politicians and our business leaders, during the COVID crisis where, where there were a lot of, no public transport. We saw businesses trying to be the champion for active mobility, in their companies. It's the same thing in our barangays, as residents. It starts with organizing at a local level. I know that, volunteer time is very precious. We all have our day jobs and our concerns with our families and extended families. But, there's not a shortage of goodwill when we talk about safety. When we talk about, equity with those people who, need help. And maybe that would be the trigger for us. But the sample that I had about the Stop For Me campaign, that was purely community-led. It was one lady who had the vision of, making, being a champion. And they were building new train stations, for a light rail. But then it was a question, how is it going to be accessible for a lot of people who have to cross the street? The schools, like Riz said, about access to schools. There's a lot of there's campaign now with with even the Asia Pacific Road Observatory at the ADB, and concerns about collecting data and making routes to school safer. So it starts with there's definitely counterpart on the agencies and on the funding agencies. What they need to see are local partners at community level. So I'd encourage you. There's a lot that could be done. Do not underestimate what you could do at barangay level.
Thank you po.
Thank you, Sir John. And thank you, Oliver, for asking your question. I think someone else has a question in line with that, but anonymous here. So let me read that out, sir. Question reads, many engineers in government and LGUs have car-centric views about the purpose of roads. Do you have any advice about how we as a civil society advocates, how we could help them change their mindsets?
Yan nga ang question it's about shared experiences. When you're talking to them about the way they're designing or the car-centric attitude about it, I think I heard from Robert the senior about the experience they had where you had people on wheelchairs trying to negotiate a curb ramp somewhere in Shaw, and getting them to experience what it means to try and be on a wheelchair and negotiate. Audits like that does help. Changing the car-centric. There's time will tell. There's a lot of new. I've met quite a few young engineers within the DOTR and DPWH where they already have a different mindset. Sorry to say, yeah, there is the changing of the guards, right? That time will come because they grew up in a different, in the US they call them motorheads, gearheads, yeah, where the trend is for fewer younger adults to have their driver's licenses. They have a different mindset about where they want to live and how they want to travel. And really, as cities all over the world compete for young talent, we have to realize that it is an economic decision that, what younger people are looking for in terms of mobility, the city should be able to offer that. Because we all know, you don't want to be wasting your even though you have YouTube and Facebook on your phone, you don't want to be wasting 2 hours every day commuting. So there is, it's to have the shared experiences and to keep on advocating. Because there are people, I hate to say it, but, younger people, younger professionals who now have a different mindset on how they see things differently. So there are allies to be had. You just have to find them.
Thank you, sir. And I completely agree. I think my personal favorite part of work from home as a young professional is the fact that I don't need to commute anymore because commute was so difficult for me before. But I agree that there are allies to be had and we just need to look for them. There's a related question, sir, and our friends from DOTR and DPWH could also chime in if you would like. Pero the question is, what do you think is the appetite of DPWH and DOTR for creating more inclusive roads from your perspective, sir? Because the move for active transport and safe spaces are have a good show of support already, but could still be better. So, your opinion, sir, from what you observed or based on the friends or allies you've talked to in the OTR and DPWH, what do you think their appetite is for creating more inclusive roads?
For active mobility, I say there's a strong appetite. Yeah. Honestly, when it comes to having an inclusive road, probably it's not there because it's such a high bar. We're starting from such a low point with our sidewalk that all we see are the problems. They cannot be done, right? in terms of accessibility. So that probably needs a bit more encouragement. But hopefully it will catch up, because the investment that we do on our public sidewalks and active mobility, they immediately translate to accessible solutions for everyone. But the appetite for active mobility definitely is there. There's no shortage of encouragement from funding agencies to look at such projects. Yeah. So then it becomes a question of following through with the infrastructure and having a supporting program for that. In Safe Routes to School movement, they have what they call the 5 E's. And we cannot look at DPWH and DOTR to just deliver the engineering solutions, right? There's education in terms of, why it's needed, how to do it, right? And there's enforcement. The enforcement component is very important because, not all of this are self-enforcing. There is encouragement that we need to do from the advocacy groups, right? And also from the local government units, anyone who's supporting the program, we need to encourage them to do this and change behavior. And then there's the evaluation. So, we cannot be, it's unfair to say that, engineering is going to solve the problem. It's not. It's upon us all, with the 5 E's to make sure that, everyone needs to have that appetite, for a better public right of way.
Thank you, sir, for that. And we would love to see that really happen. Everyone has this appetite to have more inclusive roads. And we've seen it through, the progress of getting here to the part where people are very supportive of active mobility. There's been a very long road, I believe, for all the civil society groups who've pushed for this and lobbied for this to change their minds. And I am hopeful that together we could really make it happen for more inclusive roads and not just active mobility. So here, sir, about active mobility is another question. It reads that you mentioned earlier that data were collected which helped convince politicians for active mobility. What sort of data were collected and how often were these collected?
Well, one of the items, like any traffic engineer will do, you do counting. Right. So, now you have institutional and regular bicycle and pedestrian counts along main corridors. Like what you do with traffic counts to increase, to look at the impact that you have on terms of movement. And another thing that was very important was real estate values. So rental along corridors where you have improvements in bicycle and pedestrian accommodation. At the end of the day, when you talk about money and real estate and business, that's one thing that easily convinces a lot of people. So, those are, before and after studies that you have of certain programs, right? So, yeah, those are the types of data that, are well publicized and well used to justify investment. Because at the end of the day, it's an investment on infrastructure. So the return on investment needs to be quantified.
Thank you, sir. I do remember seeing a lot of people doing bike counts in nearby spaces here in Quezon City along Commonwealth, Pinyan. And I do think they were very helpful in convincing politicians and even business groups, corporations to invest in active mobility, not just for the bicycle lane infrastructures that we see, but also for the facilities that receive the bikes, like bike racks in their offices and so on. So there, I think we are at our last question, unless someone wants to give a last minute question. But here, the last question here, sir, is that given that the existing laws on accessibility and inclusivity are a bit outdated, what movement in the government do you think is needed to institutionalize the updated international best practices so that these can be implemented moving forward?
Well, I suppose when we say the law, it's more the standards are a bit out of date and they need further refinement. Yeah. In terms of what could be done, just like the the new bicycle design guidelines from DPWH, we just need to find funding for a pedestrian facility design guideline that would incorporate accessible features. So I do remember that there's been talk within ADB about funding such a similar guidelines before. Maybe the OTR could speak to it. But that's one thing that I'm sure it's not far from where we are now, because we've done the bike plan, and then for local government units to adopt their own. Once the DPWH and DOTR have that, then it really is also incumbent for the local cities to adopt those, or to modify them, to create and incorporate them in their comprehensive plans. Because then you could have different just design guidelines, pedestrian safety action plans, and then you are then able to localize everything, and you could identify your key projects. What are you going to do around the schools? What are you going to do around the churches? So it comes down from the standards to actual and implementation plan within the comprehensive plan. So, the standards will come, but what's more important is what we do with them afterwards, and how our cities take them on.
Thank you, sir. And I think that is a very inspiring wrap up of our open forum. If there are any other people who want to ask something joke, so meron pa palang isang question, sir. A new question, fresh from our asker here. What is your comment, sir, on sidewalks that have may columns ng highway? So sidewalks, sir, na may columns ng mga highway na nagtatayo sa kanila. Do you think these sidewalks are considering VP 344? And if not, what could be a possible course of action for these columns for the sidewalks with columns?
Well, that one, it takes a bit of a will to try to resolve that. And hindi imposible eh. I remember being involved in the periphery of a project in Davao, wherein they were doing, the bike lanes. And kasi nangyayari dito, we see this in the province, we have the money to widen the road already, but we don't have the money or the authority to move the electric pole. So what happens is, you do the paving, pero may poste ng kuryente dun sa gitna, and so it's a question of phasing. But I've seen in the south some cities that are able to prioritize corridors where they're going to do bike lanes, or where they're going to do a bus network, where they would target those corridors where the poles have to be moved. And then it becomes really a coordination between the city and the utility agencies. So, I wish we could all just bury them underground, because normally that's what you would do if you were to do things differently. Yeah. So you would have underground utilities. But again, it comes to that idea of having a transition plan, know what you have, and then you could prioritize, your work, and you could, like anything in life, you could tackle, them in small chunks. Otherwise, you just get defeated, on day one. So, it could be done, cut them into small pieces, prioritize the corridors. And in the provinces, I just noticed now that some of the utilities are being laid underground. So we've done it elsewhere in Manila as well. Some localities do them. So that would be the nicest thing. That would be something to dream about. Yeah.
That is something to dream about, sir, and something I hope really happens, especially with the devolution going on with the Mandanas ruling, where some functions of national agencies are being devolved to local government units. I think that's something that we could hope for, that the LGUs will have more capacity and not just budget to implement things like this in their localities. So unless there are more questions, sir. Sorry, this will never end, but it's okay because we have a lot of time left. So we have 2 more questions here. One is not a question but a comment. Someone's sharing that
Thank you.
if you if you happen to go to Tambo, Parañaque, there's a lot of columns on their sidewalks to the point that pedestrians have to walk on the roads.
Mm-hmm. And really, when it comes to something like that, we have to figure out, what accommodation we could offer. It's the hierarchy again on the type of road and the users, because ultimately, the hierarchy really has to be for the pedestrians. And that's one thing that's quite controversial when we talk about comprehensive plans being built, being developed for cities. That when we look at our transportation plan, can we actually put hand in heart when we talk about with our planners and our traffic engineers to say that, okay, in terms of transportation, this is our hierarchy of users, and this is how we're going to design our roads. Now, what comes first are the pedestrians, the bicyclists, the transit, right? Goods and deliveries, private vehicle, and then parking last. And that's a difficult place to get into, but it takes that level of commitment to actually get things moving forward.
Truly, sir. I remember reading from a SWS survey, I think from last year, where the respondents were asked if they agree or disagree with the following statement. It says that roads in Philippine cities and municipalities will be better off if public transport, bicycles, and pedestrians are given priority over private vehicles. And 87% of the respondents agreed. So you could see that it's a common sentiment, shared sentiment among citizens that really do think we as pedestrians, commuters, and cyclists should be given priorities over our roads. And it's a challenge for our local government units to heed that call, I think. There is another question, sir. Sorry, I hope you don't mind. Do you think our COVID-19 pandemic experience will change the way that we plan mobility and transportation? If yes, if so, how would it do so?
Well, I think it has already. We could talk about how we've realized that we have to be multimodal to be resilient. So we cannot just rely on, our single mode of transport. Even we cannot just rely on public transport to get around. So it has changed that mindset. We already realize that we have to look at other things like what we're discussing now. So it has. That's, if anything, that's the silver lining. And that's not new. It's the same thing. I remember in the US after 9/11, when we talk about crossing, river crossings, like in San Francisco, wherein you have the BART train going across the river and you have 2 bridges. All of a sudden, people started talking about ferry crossings, because what happens if the bridge is bombed or the tunnel is bombed? How do we go about? So it really, for us, and we talk about, especially now with the climate conference and resilience, it has really demonstrated the fact that to be resilient as a city, we need to be multimodal on how we look at transportation. So it has changed, and that's the silver lining. If there was one.
Truly, sir, I agree that the really multimodal options need to pop up now. I have been popping up now during COVID. And I like what you said about having ferry crossings. And in slight relation to that, I would like to invite some people, the people who are watching us over Facebook and here on Zoom, you could help a movement against something that would threaten ferry crossings and even be harmful to our climate. So you could help us by signing our petition against the building of PAREX, the Pasig River Expressway, that, as you know, threatens our environment and heritage there in Pasig and everything else connected to that. So there are comments here from people. I would actually encourage the people who are commenting to speak up if you want to. Just raise your hand or unmute. But if you're shy, it's okay. I will read your comments. So some people here are commenting that it would have even been better though, sir, if the space that we allot on roads and parking are turned into public parks where everyone can socialize and exercise, because this would be accessible, free, and healthy for people around. So don't you think that's true, sir?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's a lot of movements, what they call pocket parks. Again, referencing to Western practices, where they convert by time of day or by time of week, convert parking spaces into pocket parks. And yeah, in the Philippines, in Manila in particular, it's true that we have such a shortage of public open spaces. If we look at maps, we have to tie it into our culture of the street is a living room in a lot of our more depressed areas. So it's a very lively place to be in certain areas that we live in. And how do we encourage barangays to turn those into parks? So yeah, that's definitely one way of addressing our shortage of public open spaces. And with amenities, right? Public open spaces that you would enjoy being in.
Truly, sir, not just closing off the street. I remember that the only times I've seen the streets in our residence closed are during festivals, because people would be using the streets for something else, so there would be no other cars. And I agree with your point, sir, that there's such a shortage of public open spaces like parks here in the urban spaces, because I think the nearest park that I know of is Quezon City Memorial Circle. I mean, the nearest to my residence, and it's so difficult to get there because it's in the middle of a lot of roads, and you would have to, if as a commuter, the only way I get there is through a jeep, then walking down the underpass and going back up. So it's very, very difficult. So I hope that it is something that can be possible, that we can make it happen soon, especially with our friends from different agencies and LGUs here in the Zoom call and listening in over Facebook Live.
Yeah, and if I hope it's something that we would advocate as well. As we, particularly around, we have new train stations being built. That seems to be the development opportunity. There's a lot. I'm going a bit off topic here, but talking about parks and land use planning. When we have concentrations of people coming together because there's a train station, it's also an opportunity for the local government to be more active in terms of zoning and putting in place, small areas there that could be converted into public places for amenities, for pocket parks. Just because we have a lot of people that are coming together, and we all need that mental break from being in a crowded situation. So it should be really part of our station area plans when we look at redevelopment around our railway stations.
Truly,
Sorry, off
sir.
topic.
No, okay lang po. That is actually still very on brand or on topic today, because I remember an incident from a few weeks ago where the Dolomite Beach near Manila Bay was crowded with around 4,000 people, because I guess you can't really blame the people about like seeking public space, open spaces, especially since we've all been cooped up at home for the past 2 years. I don't know how long it's been, but that is actually a lot of motivation for LGUs to provide more public spaces for us. And I agree with what you said, sir, and I like it, the idea of zoning, I guess, the near the train stations, because a lot of train stations are being developed currently. And aside from the hassle that the train station construction brings us today, because it causes a lot of traffic, it can also be indeed an opportunity for us to have more spaces, or like easier routes to go to public open spaces, green spaces of that. Okay, so there are still more comments. There's a comment from two people agreeing to the same thing, that if you throwing a little shade, someone comments that if you compare SM and Ayala malls, you know which mall has a sense of place, because the other mall seems to prioritize more green spaces than the other one. And wouldn't you agree, sir? Are there malls from your experience who have been able to convert their spaces to viable parks? Because I think that is what we have an abundance of. We have a lot of malls in our urban spaces.
Yeah, well, I know that they all realize that, I say existing, probably that is the case where, you have the big difference between the two. But I know that they are both concerned about public amenity. So, we might see different things. Again, it's a mindset on how the business ideas evolve, but they are the ones the developers have so much power in the Philippines because, to a certain extent, they are the ones who are doing long-term land use planning, more so than our, I hate to say, our local government, because they are able to bank land and then look into long-term. But that's something that I'm sure a lot of our younger planners are aware of, that needs to be addressed. That's why everyone is updating their comprehensive plans, right? And the government is asking people to go on. If you haven't done it yet, it's time you do it.
I agree, sir. And related to that is another new question. Do you have? I think we'll take this as our last question because we have spent a lot of time talking. But here, for our final question, hopefully. Do you have any comments, sir, about sa nilatag ni VP Lenny na transport plan na mas paramihan ng bike lanes at mas gawing konektado, at budget allocation para dito na gawing 14 billion pesos mula sa current na 1.6 billion pesos? You have any comments on that?
I wish they would all say that. Sana lahat sila. Yun lang masasabi ko. Hindi ko pa nakita yung iba. But, again, if anyone who puts something that, we know benefit everyone, as many people as possible, then, of course, as I would support that personally, yeah.
Thank you, sir. And I agree. Sana po lahat ganun ng plataforma para kahit sino pong manalo ay masisigurado tayong mapupush ng active mobility at pati sana inclusive roads for everyone. So, thank you, Sir John. I know napahaba yung Q&A natin. Napakaraming tanong, pero thank you so much.
salamat din. I appreciate the interest. And, it's a good sign for the energy that we have as advocates. Salamat
Yes.
din.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who sent in their questions. Alam ko baka nahihiya kayong mag-speak up kasi naka-live stream tayo. Pero we really appreciate all your active questions for us. So before we close our little webinar today, we will have some closing remarks from Toy Serna of Advocates of Inclusion in Move as One Coalition. So let's welcome Toy.
Hello po, good afternoon. Sorry, wala akong video ngayon because my internet's really bad. But I'd like to thank Move as One Coalition and Advocates of Inclusion for organizing this. It's very good and very timely, I suppose, no? Actually, baka dapat madalas natin itong ginagawa, no? Yung pag-spotlight on access and inclusion. Ito ay napaka-importante para mas mapabuti pa natin yung ating living experiences, no, for everyone. And of course, thank you to Dr. Lucas for sharing your knowledge, your experience, and hopefully itong mga pinakita nyo po, we can see that sa Pilipinas soonest, no? Hopefully your presentation has inspired many of our policy specialists and our officials in Department of Transportation, Department of Public Works and Highways, and other infra agencies, local government units, no? In behalf of Advocates of Inclusion, siguro Advocates of Inclusion is a group of development workers, no, pushing for more inclusive programs and policies in government. Ngayon nakatuto kami sa schools, no, public schools, in making public schools more physically accessible to learners with disabilities. So etong presentation po ni Dr. Lucas definitely complements yung efforts po ng Advocates of Inclusion, and we think that these are very important inputs to designing and better yung ating paligid nga, no, para mas lahat ng tao will have access to basic services, no? Will have equal access to basic services. So kami po ay nagpapasalamat, and of course we want to also share some happy news na very recently ang Department of Education has issued Department Order 44 series of 2021, which is a policy framework that should support yung learners with disabilities natin with programs, better designed programs in the Department of Education. We hope that, of course, itong policy framework na ito will translate into real changes in the procedures, budgets, and programs ng Department of Education so that our schools can be better accessed by learners with disabilities. We hope that itong panimula na ginawa ng Department of Education can also inspire, no, the Department of Transportation, Department of Public Works and Highways para sila din mag-issue ng policy framework na nakatuon at nakatutok sa pangangailangan ng persons with disabilities, no? And we hope that this translates also to, tulad ng sinasabi ni Sir kanina, to performance metrics talaga, na sana naman bilangin na talaga. Bilangin yung hindi lang yung ilang kilometers of roads na ginagamit ng ating mga sasakyan, no? Or na dinadaanan ng mga sasakyan, but more the kilometers of sidewalks, bike lanes, di ba? Masana yun yung pagbibigyang pansin din, and the pedestrian refuge islands, more pedestrian lanes, all of these things that should improve people's living experiences with these better designs, no, better designs of our environment. So yun po, maraming salamat po sa Move as One and Advocates of Inclusion for providing this space. Hopefully we can have more of this, and maybe I can call on Bianca also sa Advocates of Inclusion. Baka may gustong idagdag si Bianca that I may have missed. Biancs?
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. So sorry, yes. Okay, so thank you again to everyone to Move as One and also Advocates of Inclusion for organizing the event. And I'm also sorry that I wasn't able to catch the earlier part of the forum because of the my time difference. But anyway, so we are working with DepEd and also other stakeholders and advocates to ensure that public schools are more disability inclusive. So we have been working on policy reforms toward this end. And as a wheelchair user, and having experienced the roads in Manila, in Philippines, no, it's really difficult to get by, to go around. And I cannot just imagine how it is for wheelchair users who might not be able to afford public transportation. That's why I do and I fully support na yung ability ng ating mga pedestrian to be able to use sana yung ating pedestrian sidewalks kung meron sana, and yung ating cyclists, because currently right now in the place where I am, it's so inspiring because all of the crosswalks are at grade. So I don't get the anxiety of being on the road and knowing that I cannot cross. So there are provisions for cyclists and for the pedestrian, like everywhere from highways to inner roads. People can really use the roads, no, if you want to, and it's really an option to bike from your place to wherever you want to go, because you can really bike. So it's very inspiring, and it's something that
easily.
I hope really that we can achieve, as you mentioned earlier. So so and just I guess to mention a bit about what we were doing since before, no? So we had an accessibility audit of public schools and the communities that the inner roads, or the communities that persons with disabilities, children with disabilities were using in 2018 in Cavite. And for sure we were able to find out that many of the roads that the children with disabilities were taking from their schools to from their homes to the schools and back are not accessible. So there were many potholes. There weren't covered areas for people to walk on, and it was really difficult. And children with disabilities would often say, when they were asked during the survey if it was easy or difficult for them to get from their schools, from their homes to the schools, they would say na okay lang, madali lang. But when our auditors, who were also persons with disabilities themselves, checked the roads and then the schools, they were not accessible. So we had to ask again the children. And apparently, they found it easy because they were being carried, or nasanay na. Yun yung sabi nila, nasanay na. They got used to it. So it wasn't because the roads were accessible. So we're very happy that DepEd is able to of course, recognize the needs of persons with disabilities, children with disabilities. So yes, to having more of these kinds of conversations. And I'm very happy that I was able to catch also what Sir Lucas was talking about earlier. So thank you so much, and I am happy to see everyone this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca, and thank you, Toix. Thank you both for sharing and closing our little webinar. So before we officially close for today, we want to ask everyone how our webinar was. So you may give me, your feedback is important to us, so you may answer our short form at this link, bit.ly/daan-feedback. We've also sent it to our chat. And we'd also like to extend opportunities for you to participate in this movement along with us. So the next slide, you'll see a poster on Voices, or initial analysis of the disability sector in the Philippines. So if you'd like to learn more about the disability sector, you may join us next week, Thursday, November 11, for a research discussion on the access of the disability sector to social and public services, education, work and employment, civic participation, and governance. So you may register for this session at tinyurl.com/staff voices. You can see it there on the screen, and I will send it there on the chat. So you can register for our discussion about the research. So all attendees will receive a copy of the research shown as well. So next, we also want to extend again this invitation to sign our petition against Parex. So you can do that at bit.ly no to Parex. You will see there are resources or references why it's important to halt the Pasig River Expressway. If you would like to connect with us, you can email us at moveasonecoalition@gmail.com, and to be in the loop of all our other future events, you can follow our social media accounts. On Facebook, we are Move As One Coalition, and on Twitter, we are at Move As One PH. So that's it, I think. So maraming salamat sa lahat. You may answer our feedback form again at bit.ly/daan-feedback. But I think this is where we sign off sa ating Facebook live stream. So thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been such an informative and enlightening experience to be with you today. So for our participants in Zoom, please stay for a while so that we can take a